And she's the lead author of 2 college economics textbooks, micro and macroeconomics, which are the starting points for her effort to develop an economic theory, contextual economics, that will have more relevance to the real world concerns than does the dominant economic pattern. And the title of her recent essay says it all, A New Economics for the 21st Century. She's also director of the Social Science Library, which is 9,000 titles on the frontier thinking in sustainable development and human well-being, and is a member of the board of Ceres and other non-academic involvements. She's very active trying to inform and motivate our business leaders to think differently about their activities in their companies and to recognize social and ecological health as a significant long-term corporate goal.
Well, that's going to be hard to live up to. And also, of course, coming after Gus Speth is hard to live up to. Gus laid out a very inspiring vision for where we might be going to go. And I'm an economist, and I'm going to be raising some of the tough issues about what we're going to have to figure out on the way. And I'll be raising more questions than I'll be answering. But if you saw that the title for what I'm talking about is What Can We Hope for the World in 2075, I want to start by thinking about the fact that that's 65 years from now. So who among you have a child or grandchild or other relative who's going to be likely around in that time? That's 65 years from now. So that's very relevant to all of us. There may be people here who are young enough that they will be around then. People often make predictions or draw scenarios that go out to the year 2050. I opted to look another quarter of a century farther, and frankly my reason is that I see such difficult times in the near term that I wanted to look towards a time when the human race may be more in a mode of adjusting and making the best of things. In trying to imagine forward to the last quarter of this century, it's tempting to try to cover everything, and when I started preparing for this, that's what I was planning to do. That turned out not to be possible. So I'm going to start with some details on 2 issues that are going to affect the future trajectory of the human societies, and then we'll bring them together with a larger number of other issues which I'll toss out more in terms of questions. And the 2 large issues will be first population, where I think there's actually some good news, which is why I wanted to talk about that, and also the nature of the corporation, where there are a lot of open questions. The good news about population is that it isn't as bad as we thought, especially the way it looked in the 1990s, when we were getting median projections from the UN that were very scary. I mean, the latest median projection is for 9 billion people by 2050, but we were seeing 12 billion and more as their projections. There's a really interesting story about how they have come down, and if I don't have time to get to it, I hope someone will ask me about it afterwards. But I want to talk about the demographic transition, which you've probably all heard of, and which is turning out to be a little different from what was thought in the 1950s when demographers started first talking about it. In the first stage of the demographic transition, birth rates and death rates are about equal, population isn't growing, and populations are pretty sparse. In the second stage, death rates go down, while birth rates stay high. And that happened in the 18th through the 20th centuries, that death rates kept going down with improved sanitation and nutrition, but birth rates stayed high, and so we had the huge population explosions of the last 2 centuries. In the third stage, birth rates do start declining, but they're still higher than the death rates, and the population growth slows down. Sorry. Okay. In the fourth stage, birth and death rates equalize at the same place, at a low rate, and population growth is 0, but the population, of course, is much larger than it was before. Well, now, those are the 4 stages that were predicted in the 1950s. What was not anticipated was that birth rates would keep declining. The fertility rate that keeps a steady population is 2.1 children per adult female. Amazingly, the UN is now predicting that by the time population stabilizes, it's going to be 1.85. Or rather, by the time the birth rate stabilizes, the global fertility rate is 1.85. That means continually declining population. And the low variant prediction of the UN is that population will stop growing by 2040, and that the population will then be 8 billion. The high variant suggests 9 billion. But I regard this as very good news. Now, there are some other really important things going on in population. By the way, the reasons for this change is several. One, urbanization. As people move out of rural settings, they have fewer children. Another very important one, availability of contraceptives. And finally, women's access to education, to income, and the ability to own property and to have control over the income they earn. And if any of those things ceased, then these projections of continuing declining fertility might be reversed. Age is, of course, a very important issue. Where earlier theorists focused on the economic strains caused by the high youth dependency ratio, which is the ratio of children to adults who are working and bringing in income, the current concern is increasingly turning towards the old age dependency ratio, where we have, for example, China, where pensions and medical and other support for the elderly are looming as probably the leading social crisis. In the more developed regions, 21% of the population is already over 60, and that proportion is projected to reach 33% by 2050. In 1950, those older than 80 were a negligible proportion of the population in all nations. By 2050, that group is expected to be nearly 10% of the population in Europe, 7.5% in North America. There may be some cultural benefits from a major shift in average age in populations. I think we can hope for more wisdom, possibly less violence, maybe better music. But there also are economic impacts of an aging population. The costs of care, including medicine, go up. And while more people in the older age ranges are or should be receiving pensions, fewer are working and paying taxes. Personal savings rates tend to increase as people move from their 20s to middle age, and then to fall as people move into their retirement years. So a shift towards more in the latter group means that the national savings rate everywhere is going to be declining, leaving less money for investment. Population aging seems likely to emphasize the trend towards increasing the expansion of the service sector, which is in any case occurring very rapidly in virtually all economies. That may seem like a good thing when you're thinking about trying to dematerialize the economy for environmental reasons, but we have to watch this pretty carefully. The service sector isn't as dematerialized as people sometimes think. Consider what happens when you visit a doctor's office and all the stuff that gets thrown out with each visit. A few more issues related to population include urbanization. Cities are the growth nodes throughout the world, and that is basically a very good thing. If we have everybody spread out, the use of resources tends to be greater. The growth of the rural population in absolute terms has actually ceased by now worldwide. And all population additions from here on are urban. Unless patterns of cohabitation change, with smaller families that we can project, the number of households is likely to rise. That's not a good thing if it's separate single-family houses. If it's denser urban population in apartments, that is a good thing on the whole. There are always trade-offs, of course, social impact, kinds of ways of living, and the environmental impact. There is a direct connection between several direct connections between population and climate change. The more people who, at any particular standard of living, the more impact on the climate and on the environment in general. If the same number of people continues and you have a changed form of living and consumption, the impact can decrease. But when we think about more people flowing into cities, we have to face the fact that out of the 20 largest cities, 15 are located either on the ocean or on river deltas where they're at danger from sea level rise. So there's another of these complex interactions. And finally, in talking about population, I'll mention the issue of migration. Gus mentioned the possibility of environmental refugees, and that is a very serious, very real possibility, I believe, because climate change, which we're not probably going to stop not going to act in ways that will mean that there are no impacts of climate change. It is likely that there will be sea level rise. And we've already seen some temperature changes, there are diseases spreading, and so forth. So these impacts are going to hit the poor most severely, most quickly, soonest, and that is going to be a cause of migration. Migrants from the poorest countries tend to go to their neighbors first, so then you have a spillover ripple effect of other poor countries being extremely stressed. And sooner or later, there is increased pressure on the richer countries. We have a very serious moral dilemma, we, the human race, and the rich countries in particular, as to whether we're going to be supplying resources to assist the poor countries to gain the resilience that will allow them to adapt as climate change occurs. Or will we welcome the migrants to our shores? Or will we build walls and shoot them when they try to climb over? And I think we're going to be facing these possibilities within most of our lifetimes. I have suggested that fertility can be affected by availability of contraceptives and women's access to education and income. The size of the population right now is not directly in our control. It is not, as in that sense, a human construct. But I now want to move to a topic which is a human construct, and that is the nature of the economy, and particularly the nature of corporations, because our economy is very much dominated and determined by corporations. The overriding problem, again, as Gus has already said, is that the legal, cultural, and economic systems and institutions affecting corporations promote profitability as the only goal and do not motivate corporations to include long-run social and environmental health and well-being in their objectives. There are two popular types of prescriptions for bringing corporate behavior in line with sustainability. Neither, in my opinion, is sufficient. The first prescription comes from theorists of corporate behavior who increasingly note the value for reputation, for attracting customers, workers, and investors, if corporations do try to act in accord with human well-being. And if they don't, the risks associated with failing to anticipate future government regulations and the real cost savings from pollution avoidance and conservation of resources. Those are all valid reasons for businesses to take socially desirable actions that do not obviously contribute to their bottom line. They do contain, however, an implication that in some less obvious ways, being good will be profitable. And this does work in some cases. Walmart is a fascinating example. Being good environmentally has been very, very profitable for Walmart. They have cut their costs a whole lot. And by the way, Joyce Habusha, who is here, is one of the people who has been in dialogue with Walmart from the investor point of view and helped to persuade them to look very seriously at this issue. And that's very significant real progress. But there's the other side of the equation, which is Walmart's social impact. Their business model depends on reducing all costs. Fine on the environment, but they have huge labor costs. They are probably the largest private employer in the world. They employ an enormous number of people, and by and large, the consensus is they don't treat them very well. The wages are low, the health benefits tend to be poor, and there are a lot of ways that Walmart keeps people from being able to attain long enough tenure or enough hours to be able to get the health benefits. And they are externalizing tremendous social costs onto the communities where they work. And when it's part of the business model, it's very hard to see how being better is going to actually be good for the bottom line. And at the other place where this idea that being good is good for the bottom line has to do with the product. If what you're selling is weapons or cigarettes or junk food or junk toys, then it's pretty hard to see how you can, or petroleum, it's hard to see how you can become a socially responsible company and not totally lose your identity. Now, the other popular prescription for how corporations can be persuaded to behave better has to do with externalizing the costs that corporations have been, they have been externalizing costs. We would like to change the system so that the costs they create are internalized, which means that the company pays for the costs they create. And the most obvious example that everybody talks about is pollution. If a company creates pollution, somebody else shouldn't bear the cost of cleaning up or the cost of ill health. And this approach requires extremely intelligent regulatory action. It's also not popular with corporations because a good way to get rich is to externalize your costs. And even when it's done very well, it can solve some problems, but not all. And it's especially difficult to find ways to internalize what some economists are calling meta-externalities, which are the impact of the economic system as a whole on the larger social and ecological environment. Negative meta-externalities, for example, include the toxins and non-biodegradable wastes that are building up in huge quantities throughout all the Earth's ecosystems. No single corporation has the major responsibility for these. They come out of the whole system. And how are you going to persuade one company after another to pay their share? People are working at this, and there's tort law which can be applied, but it's a very difficult way to go. When firms do not receive price signals that tell them when they're producing things that do harm, either to those whom they affect directly or to the whole society, or to the ecosystem on which the economy ultimately depends, then you have what economists call market failure. And our system is absolutely full of market failures, and indeed, as Nicholas Stern, or the Stern Report famously said, the CO2 buildup in the environment is the largest market failure the world has ever known, and it is a meta-externality. So we can gain a lot from getting prices right and from showing where good behavior and profits do converge. We have to face the fact, I believe, that they don't always converge, particularly in the short to the medium run. And there continue to be strong incentives in the system we experience for behavior that may harm many in the long run, with a fair chance that the people who gain the most by engaging in those activities, by having their corporations do so, are going to go free with the winnings. Until there has been deeper change, we can expect more of the kind of harm that was inflicted by Enron, Halliburton, and probably some respected, not yet indicted firms such as Goldman Sachs. So, what kind of deeper change is being proposed that could be taken seriously after the next wave of financial or business disasters? I don't think there is room right now, but there will be other disasters because there continue to be short-term behaviors which are good for particular firms or particular actors in those firms and are setting the stage for more disasters. So what we need is to be ready with good ideas for how the corporate form can be changed, how the market that depends on right now on corporations, how that market can be changed, and have those ideas ready for the next wave of disasters when people may be more ready for larger change. One idea, which I'm particularly fond of, is to revive a legal structure in which corporate charters can be withheld or revoked from those corporations that are not contributing adequately towards a sustainable, humane economy. Sustainable, humane economy is nice. The acronym is SHE. This idea of corporate charters could be applied on an industry-by-industry basis, and accounting is a case which, to my mind, is especially ripe for this, since the major social capital of accounting firms is the perception that they can be trusted to tell the truth. So if a new type of charter would make a particular firm more obviously trustworthy, for example, by building in strong barriers against conflicts of interest or capture by interested partners, accounting firms might find it in their interest to adopt that kind of a charter. So there's a possibility that wouldn't require force. If somebody developed that possibility and offered it, it might be voluntarily accepted. Now, there was a flurry of interest in corporate charters in the 1970s, and in fact there were a couple of cases where charters were revoked for egregiously lawless activity. But continually growing corporate power over recent decades has made the rechartering idea seem quixotic, and I don't think it's going to return until there's a new wave of citizen concern and outrage. There's an organization called the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, a mouthful, CELDF. I'm going to afterwards make available a little sheet with websites for some of the organizations I'm mentioning, so that some of them you may want to look up. CELDF is an organization that for a while played with the idea of rechartering, decided the world wasn't ready for it, and has moved to a different approach, which is the creation of municipal ordinances, which doesn't attempt to reform corporations, but rather to encourage the countervailing powers of communities which are directly affected. With the help of CELDF, about 10% of the municipalities in Pennsylvania, where this organization began, have adopted ordinances which ban corporate incursions on local control of land, water, and other resources. The Pennsylvania legislature is fighting back on the side of the corporations. In 2005, they created the Agriculture, Communities, and Rural Environments Law, which gives the state attorney general discretion to rule in disputes between corporations and communities, including the right to overturn municipal laws. The next move was made by a group of Pennsylvanians who have issued the Chambersburg Declaration, stating, among other things, a goal of revoking the authority of the corporate minority to impose political, legal, and economic systems that endanger our human and natural communities. And they are intending to bring together a constitutional convention to draft a new state constitution to be ratified by popular referendum. This is a real fight. CELDF, to be sure, is promoting one of the more radical approaches. I will turn for a moment to a more mainstream voice and quote from Michael Porter, who 15 years ago wrote, "The ideal system is one in which the goals of owners and the agents who represent them are aligned with those of corporations and of society as a whole. What is needed in many respects is a re-examination of our entire capital market paradigm. That means thinking about how investments can flow toward the companies that will pay sufficient attention to the what and how of production, producing in a sustainable manner things that contribute to human well-being." One idea on this comes from Richard Rosen of TELUS Institute, who has proposed the establishment of industry regulatory boards for each major industry. He emphasizes the need for public input into the allocation of capital. He cites the regulatory model of public utility commissions called PUCs, and notes that PUCs are best known for rate setting with respect to energy, telecommunications, and water. But even more important is their little-known role in approving all major utility investments and all utility products for which they set the rates. They are given this authority to approve investments because a large part of the cost of all utility services is the cost of paying off capital investments to plant and equipment. Rosen believes that this idea could start by being applied to industries where the social good or the potential or actual social harm is especially obvious, such as agriculture, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and financial services. So that's an idea of a rather specific way of channeling investment to where it's needed and away from where it's doing harm. Rechartering and public utility commissions are two examples on the regulatory side of change that would be imposed from outside. The alternative is reform from within. If not starting from within corporations, at least coming from within the system that sets the incentives and the standards that determine the behavior of corporations. A major part of the system is the investors who provide capital to business. And some investors are trying to use the proxy process and company dialogue to impress a longer, more socially sensitive view on some managers. The UN principles of responsible investing encourage investors to pay close attention to the environmental, social, and governance impacts, those are the ESG trio, of the firms in which they invest. And this initiative is beginning to have noticeable effects in how particularly European and Asian investors where they put their money. And large U.S. investors are generally well behind, with the exception of some major pension funds. But the U.S. investors are, those that are global, and many are feeling pressure from their global partners to catch up in applying the UN principles. A different approach to reform proposes drafting new institutional and legal structures for corporations, drafts that might seem too radical in ordinary times, but could be put forth when new crises force attention on the gaps between corporate incentives and social needs. A notable example is the new principles for corporate design that have emerged from a program called Corporation 2020, led by Alan White at the TELUS Institute. And Ceres in Boston has also been laying out expectations for sustainable corporations, including the expectation that companies will approach all product development and product management decisions with full consideration of the social and environmental impacts of the product throughout its life cycle. Disney has just become an affiliate with Ceres, and it's going to be really, really interesting to see how they deal with this idea. The world in which companies would follow the TELUS or Ceres principles, even if this means not producing cigarettes or Barbie dolls, would be quite a different world from the one we live in. Principles such as those I've just cited are ready for application when we get to that world, but they probably don't have the ability by themselves to bring it about. The profit-driven world that we live in now can be softened with notions of reputation risk or climate risk or resource shortage risk, and it can be stiffened by regulations to internalize externalities. But all of these forces together may not be sufficient to focus corporations on their needed contribution to true sustainability. So that brings us to what alternative is there to the big corporations. And now I know I'm speaking to a room full of people who have done a lot of thinking about that. I know that there are many people in this room, each of whom has been working on one or more particular type of alternative to the large corporation. I'm going to cite a paper written by Marjorie Kelly, who's a longtime writer on responsible business, where she talks about social business or for benefit enterprise, meaning firms that do require profits in order to survive, but which subordinate profit-making to a larger mission. And a prime example is the Grameen Danone Foods, a 50-50 joint venture between Groupe Danone, the multinational yogurt maker, and Groupe Danone, and the Grameen companies, which have made microfinance famous. Kelly cites three general types of for-benefit companies. One is stakeholder-owned companies, which put ownership in the hands of non-financial stakeholders. That includes employee-owned companies and other kinds of cooperatives. The second is mission-controlled companies, which separate ownership and profits from control and organizational direction. They could include non-profit venture capital firms, for-profit philanthropy, as in Google.org, or the foundation-owned corporations of Northern Europe. And the third type are public-private hybrids. where profit-driven and mission-driven design elements are combined to create unique structures. It's interesting to note that a stumbling block for many of these examples, such as cooperatives, has been the difficulty of raising capital, which takes us back to the issue raised earlier, and where I cited Michael Porter and Richard Rosen, the need to attract capital not only to where it's going to give the most and the quickest profits, but to where society's needs are served. Again, there are numerous attempts to address that issue. An interesting one is being promoted by the NGO Green America, led by Alyssa Gravitz, which is promoting clean energy victory bonds based on the victory bonds of World War II. These would be U.S. Treasury savings bonds, available for as little as $25 each, to encourage citizens to invest in the domestic clean energy industry. Representative Filner of California, who did not lose in the recent election, is committed to proposing legislation for clean energy victory bonds. So, to summarize where we are at this point, I've reviewed some options for bringing corporate behavior into line with the needs of humanity in the 21st century, reform coming from within the existing system, or more radical change that is imposed on corporations from outside. But that inside-outside distinction is not really easy to make in the U.S. right now, because there is such an excessively close connection between corporations and government. So government is not outside corporations, and therefore if we look to regulations as the solution, we can't expect them those regulations to come from government, whether it's in an effort to internalize externalities or to change charters or any of the other things which require regulations. Now, there is another interesting partial answer to this, which is the universal investors. That is, investors who own part of all the big companies in the economy. The major pension funds might be able to exclude a few corporations, but they basically have a stake in the entire economy. Given that fact, that means they have a stake in the future, because the pension funds, after all, need to be able to continue paying out pensions to people 20, 30, 40 years from now. So if the whole economy is going down, if the meta-externalities are such that the climate for economic activity is continually less good, the pension funds recognize that that is not good for them in carrying out their function. So large pension funds have been playing quite an important role in confronting corporations through proxy resolutions, through voting on those resolutions, and through dialogue with companies who, when they're faced with a proxy resolution, feel, gosh, we'd really rather this doesn't come to a vote, and at that point some of them are willing to talk with the people who have been proposing those resolutions. So that's still working within the system. A slightly different approach is the kind of citizen mobilization to enhance the countervailing power of local and virtual communities, which depends on a shift away from businesses that have not aligned their behaviors with society's interests. And such a shift can be dimly imagined as being led by the preferences of individual and institutional consumers. And don't forget that governments, by the way, are huge consumers of the products of business. So it's government as consumer as well as government as regulator that we have to keep in mind. The people involved in CELDF, which I mentioned earlier, believe that that kind of a shift in preference, in choices of how to interact with business, is only going to come about as part of an even more ambitious idea to address deficiencies in the charters of the states and ultimately even in the Charter of the United States of America, which were originally written with a strong bias towards the owners of property. And that bias has drifted towards corporations, not even necessarily to the owners of the corporations, but to those who have the power to hand out the money to influence government. A cleaving of the relationship between corporations and government would, of course, open the door to many other possibilities. In the end, the role of corporations and their contributions to an environmentally sustainable and socially equitable economy are, however, political more than they are economic issues. And now I'm going to try to bring all of this together with more of the economic issues that I think we're going to face. I've talked about two big issues. First, the need to feed, clothe, and house at least 8 billion people by mid-century, with the hope that the global population may have stabilized and be declining by then. And second, a picture of our economic system with corporations now running the show and not leading us in the right direction. I've struggled to make a plausible picture of how the corporate-run economy could change in the right direction. And if you're thinking that I haven't been very successful, I agree. Looking at these giants as they are now, it's very hard to imagine appropriate change. But the fault in that may lie in our imaginations, not in the world of possibilities. I'm 66 years old. For those of you who are my age or older, we can look back 6 decades and see extraordinary amounts of change in technology, in culture, in how people understand the world. If we turn around and project that amount of change forward, the danger is that we're going to expect that change will continue in the same directions. And that is not necessarily so. Change is going to be forced on us. The number of people in the world at any one time is given, and looking at future generations, however, I've suggested ways in which that number can be somewhat affected. The limits of nature's tolerance and the availability of natural resources are not human constructs. When we come up against these immutable facts of numbers and limits, then other things which had seemed impossible to change may be forced to change. As I try to pull the strands together to consider what we have ahead of us, there are a number of other issues that I think we have to take into account. We are probably going to go on using cheap energy long enough to push the atmospheric concentrations of CO2 well above the present level and far above the level that's considered safe. If we do so, at some point, the disastrous consequences will become so clear that something will be done, whether by human agency or by natural forces, to make fossil fuel energy a lot more expensive. And that's a central issue, the cost of energy. If we were really smart, and if right now we made the highest priority for fossil fuel use the construction of sustainable alternative energy sources and systems, the cost of those alternatives could decline fast enough to push the era of high energy costs into a very small period, perhaps only a decade. Consider little Portugal and big China, which are both showing some of what's possible. The government of Portugal led a program of investment in which the percentage of renewables in Portugal's energy grid rose from 17% to 45% in just 5 years. 2005 to 2010. China is also moving very fast to create a huge solar industry, but they remain heavily dependent on coal. Looking at these examples, and at the historical and present examples of human denial of reality, it seems most probable that rather than compressing the energy transition away from a carbon dependence into a really short period, we're probably going to face a very long, harsh period of transition. And one of the characteristics of that period will be very high energy costs. The transition, my most optimistic guess is that it'll dominate at least the 20 years from 2015 to 2035. Less optimistically, it could continue till 2050. Gus Speth outlined disasters that will follow environmental failure. Hopefully, we won't go all the way to the fortress world, but we are going to be facing a period of great disruption. Now, we've all heard about the positive elements of the energy transition: new jobs, new investment opportunities in rapid expansion of sustainable energy technologies, urban redesign, redirection of investment to energy and materials savings products and production techniques, new jobs also in environmental cleanup, restorations of soils and forests. So there is a great potential for new jobs and jobs that are contributing to a better economy. But here's what worries me. It's not only energy costs that are going to be rising, it's also the cost of many raw materials as essential resources like water and wood become scarce, while the cost of processing and producing materials like metals will also go up with the cost of energy prices. And where this is going to be felt is the bottom line, people's incomes. Average wages have been rising more or less steadily for 250 years, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That is largely related to the rise in labor productivity, although we have periods like the last couple of decades where labor productivity was rising, but wages were not rising. The benefits of rising productivity were basically captured by the owners of capital. But the point I'm making is that the rise in labor productivity was very largely a result of the fact that every worker had more capital and more materials and more energy to work with. If we're going to talk about an economy which is more labor intensive, and less energy and materials intensive, it's very hard to see how this won't roll back the wage effect. So that related to the price of the products that people are producing, their income is going to go down. Now, I've talked about this with Julie Shore. She's an optimist who believes that labor productivity can be rising by increased inputs of information and intelligence and some of the technologies that are not so materials intensive, although computer technologies are still pretty intensive in energy and materials. I hope she's right. Her image is that we can have people working shorter hours in jobs that require less materials and less energy, so that we're having less impact on the world and people are living good lives. Well, that, of course, comes down to the question of what you mean by good lives. And I think it becomes increasingly evident that the kind of good life that is possible for the future is one that has a lot less material flow. So we can argue about what are the constituent parts of GDP. The suggestion is being increasingly often made that GDP is not going to be able to keep growing, and there are suggestions of having different measures of an economy's success, so that we can say, yes, the economy is becoming more successful even while GDP goes down. But it's going to be very different. And when the world gets around to seriously working to prevent climate change, that's also going to cause dramatic shifts in where the economy puts its resources of money and human effort, as well as materials and efforts and energy. I'm hoping these shifts will entail some potential for changing the allocation of what society produces, an opportunity to move towards a less unequal distribution. If this opportunity is lost, the lifestyle changes of less to consume are largely going to come in terms of reduction in the well-being among the people who are already the poorest. Now, that's my image of the period of transition. Between now and 2040 or 2050, and it's going to be very difficult, and we're all going to have to accept a lot of kinds of change that we had previously assumed were bad changes. And it's going to require shifting the way we think about our lives and what is valuable in our lives to be able to accept that there's some very good potentials. Most of the people who talk about the transition talk about reducing working hours, as Gus did. That's a very desirable outcome. When you put it together with the population, the demographic changes, where you have a smaller proportion of the entire population of the working age, and you put it back together with a possible decline in productivity, that does once again mean consuming a lot less. So there's the picture of the period of the transition during which energy is terribly expensive. Now, let's look forward to the time when that energy transition is complete, and we have cheap energy that is produced through renewable methods. Particularly, of course, the tropics are the places where there's a huge amount of sunlight. The tropics have always been the poorest. Suddenly they're going to be the Saudi Arabia of the solar future. And one can hope that that begins to reverse some of the other difficulties. For example, I have not really looked into desalination. I know that it's highly energy intensive. But supposing you have so much cheap solar energy that you can desalinize ocean water and begin to reverse the terrible water shortages that we're going to be facing in the next few decades. So there are some optimistic projections one could make of the post-transition period leading up to 2075. I would also hope that by then science will have reemerged as a source of trusted information and understanding. It's one of the tragedies of the present situation that science has been getting such a hard knock, and there's been so much disinformation that is increasingly acceptable. I mentioned earlier the danger of sea level rise to 15 out of our 20 largest cities. By 2050, I would hope that both the science and the acceptance of science will have improved enough so that at least people will know how much more sea level rise to expect, how fast, and what to do about it. So that is the beginning of the period I hope for of adaptation and good predictions of what to expect. The issues I've talked about are ones which we certainly have to face on a national level. The United States, of course, is the highest consuming nation in the world, taking all materials and energy together by a large factor. And if the developing world is to be given the space to catch up in a world where resources are constrained, some people have to consume less for others to consume more. All the indications, therefore, point in the same direction, a future with less stuff per household. If this is inevitable, we might as well make the best of it. Reduce throughput, reduce work hours, reduce take-home pay, and increase leisure and well-being. I think I probably should stop there. Yep, I'll stop there. I had too many more pages. So the suggestion was made at the beginning that we take 5 minutes, and we will be very stringent about this, only 5 minutes before the question period begins, that we have a little bit of time for open conversation so that you can turn around to the people closest to you, find out what they're interested in, why they're here, what you have in common. And in 5 minutes, we'll then open up for questions.